The jar sat in the back of the stove in almost every black kitchen south of the Mason-Dixon line. Clear on Monday, dark gold by Friday. That jar of saved grease was not a leftover, it was a strategy. A Depression era grandmother could walk into a store with less than $1 and walk out with enough to keep 6 people fed for a week. Not because she found a sale, because she already knew 30 ways to stretch what she had before she ever left the house. Number 7 on this list turned a handful of dirt cheap roots into something that replaced the most expensive item in the pantry. Number 14 kept families eating fresh 12 months a year without setting foot in a grocery store. The grocery industry did not beat these women. These women outsmarted the grocery industry. Hit subscribe because this is not a history lesson. It is a blueprint that still works. Here are 25 Depression-era tricks Black grandmothers used to beat high grocery bills. Number 25, stretching meat with breadcrumbs and filler. A pound of ground beef in the 1930s was still a luxury in a sharecropper household, so grandmothers made it go further. Stale bread soaked in a little milk got crumbled and worked into the meat by hand. 1 pound became 2. The meatloaf that came out of the oven fed 8 people, and nobody at the table knew half of it was bread. Some women added oatmeal instead. Others used crushed soda crackers or cold leftover rice. The principle was always the same. You never served the meat straight. You built around it, you stretched it until it covered every plate. By the time the Depression was over, this was not a survival trick anymore. It was tradition. Families kept doing it for decades because the food simply tasted right. Number 24, saving every last drop of bacon grease. Nothing left that stove without giving something back. Bacon grease went into a tin can or a mason jar and sat by the burner until it was needed. It replaced butter. It replaced store-bought lard. It seasoned cast iron. It flavored collard greens, cornbread batter, fried eggs, and reheated rice. 1 strip of bacon could season 3 days of cooking if the grease was saved properly. Some families kept the same jar going for weeks, layering fresh drippings on top of old ones, the flavor deepening with every pour. A grandmother who threw away grease was a grandmother who had never been hungry. That was the unspoken rule, and in a Depression-era kitchen, it was law. Number 23, growing greens from seeds saved year after year. Collard seeds cost nothing when they came from last season's plants. A grandmother would let 2 or 3 stalks go to flower at the end of summer, wait for the pods to dry on the stem, then strip them off, shake the seeds loose, and fold them into a paper envelope for the winter. Come spring, those seeds went straight into the dirt beside the house. No nursery, no seed catalog. Turnip greens, mustard greens, collards, all of it came from seeds that had been handed down from mother to daughter, sometimes across 3 generations. The same line of greens growing in the same patch of yard for 30 years. The grocery store never saw a dime of it. Number 22, planning every meal for the week before spending a single cent. A Depression-era grandmother did not walk into a store and figure it out as she went. She sat down at the kitchen table on Saturday night with a pencil and a scrap of paper and wrote out exactly what the family would eat for the next 7 days. Monday was beans and cornbread because the beans needed time to soak. Tuesday used whatever greens came out of the garden. Wednesday was the leftover beans mashed into patties and fried in a skillet. Thursday, she might stretch a piece of salt pork across a pot of rice. Every meal connected to the one before it, and every ingredient had a destination before it ever came through the door. She knew to the ounce how much flour the week required, how many eggs she needed, and whether the lard tin would last. If it did not add up, She adjusted the plan, not the budget. Walking into a grocery store without a list was considered reckless, the same as leaving the front door wide open in a rainstorm. That weekly plan turned a handful of cheap staples into 21 meals without a single scrap going uneaten. Number 21, buying the cuts of meat nobody else wanted. Neck bones, pig feet, chicken backs and gizzards, oxtails back when they cost almost nothing and the butcher practically gave them away. White customers walked right past these cuts at the counter, and black grandmothers picked them up for pennies a pound. The trick was knowing what low heat and long time could do to a piece of meat that looked like scrap. Braised neck bones fell off the bone after 4 hours in a covered pot. Pig feet turned into a rich, gelatinous stew that warmed a house on a January night. Chicken backs made a stock so deep it became the base for everything else that week. These women did not buy cheap cuts because they lacked taste. They bought them because they had more skill than the people paying 3 times the price for something easier to cook. Number 20, bartering eggs and garden vegetables with neighbors instead of spending cash. Money was scarce, but eggs were currency. A grandmother with 6 laying hens had something better than coins in her apron pocket. She traded a dozen eggs for a quart of milk from the woman down the road. She swapped a basket of ripe tomatoes for a sack of cornmeal. The system ran on trust, and it ran without a receipt. Whole blocks and entire rural roads operated this way during the worst years. No middleman, no markup, no store, just 2 women standing at a fence line on a Tuesday morning deciding what their families needed that week and making it happen with what they already had. There is a reason these tricks worked, and it was not luck. Black grandmothers during the Depression were operating inside a system that was built to keep them poor. Sharecropping meant debt before the first seed hit the ground. Jim Crow meant the better paying jobs were locked behind a door they could not open. Redlining meant the neighborhoods with the cheapest groceries were the neighborhoods they were not allowed to live in, so they built a parallel economy inside their own kitchens. Every trick on this list is a workaround invented by women who got no help and expected none. The grocery bill was the one fight where intelligence and discipline could win against a rigged system, and they won it every single week, not with coupons, not with charity, with knowledge passed from mother to daughter while standing over a hot stove. Number 19, storing food underground when there was no icebox in the house. Before electric refrigerators became common in black households across the rural South, grandmothers kept food cool the same way their own grandmothers had. They dug a root cellar, sometimes nothing more than a deep hole lined with boards and covered with a heavy lid, and they used the steady underground temperature to preserve what the kitchen could not. Sweet potatoes went down there by the bushel after the fall harvest, layered in straw so they would not touch and start to rot. Jars of pickled vegetables sat on low shelves in the dark. A crock of sauerkraut or chow chow could last for months in that cool air. Butter wrapped in a damp cloth stayed firm for days without melting. Some families used a spring house if they lived near running water, setting jars of milk and cream directly in the cold stream so the current kept the temperature down. Others hung a wire basket into the well shaft, lowering a jug of buttermilk until it dangled just above the water line where the air stayed cool year-round. None of this required a single purchase from a store. The ground itself was the refrigerator, and it cost nothing but the labor to dig it. A grandmother who kept a good root cellar could buy produce at its cheapest in late summer, store it properly, and feed her family through the winter without paying the inflated prices that came once the growing season ended. The savings were enormous. She was not just cooking, she was running a supply chain out of a hole in the yard, and it worked every single year. Number 18, thinning milk to make it stretch the full week. A gallon of milk was expensive relative to what a sharecropping family actually earned. So grandmother stretched it. Half a glass of whole milk, half a glass of water, a tiny pinch of sugar stirred in. For cooking, the milk went even further. A splash in the cornbread batter, a careful pour in the gravy, a measured cup in the banana pudding. Nobody got a full glass to drink at the table. Nobody complained. The trick was distributing the nutrition across every single meal instead of letting anybody pour it all at once. 1 gallon could last a full week in a house with 5 or 6 children because it was never consumed straight. It was always stretched into something larger. Number 17, making 1 chicken feed the family 3 separate meals. The first meal was the roasted bird itself, served on a Sunday after church with rice and gravy. Whatever meat was left on the bones after dinner went into a pot of water with onion ends, a few peppercorns, and whatever celery tops or carrot stubs were in the icebox. That became stock, and the stock became Monday's soup. By Tuesday, the last scraps of meat picked off the carcass were folded into rice or stirred into a thick gravy and served over biscuits. 3 full meals from 1 animal. The bones went into the garden as fertilizer. The fat was skimmed off the soup and saved for the grease jar. A single chicken, bought at the right price or raised in the backyard, could carry a family nearly halfway through the week if the woman cooking knew how to think 3 meals ahead. Number 16, canning everything the garden produced in summer so the family could eat in winter. August was not a month of rest. It was a month of boiling jars, green beans, whole tomatoes, sliced peaches, pear preserves, chow chow, pickled beets, pepper relish. If it grew in the garden or came cheap from a neighbor's tree, it went into a mason jar, got sealed with a hot lid, and went onto the pantry shelf. By October, that shelf looked like a wall of glass, and that wall was winter. A grandmother with a full canning shelf did not need the grocery store from November through March. She opened a jar of tomatoes in January and served them like they had just come off the vine. The work was brutal, standing over a pot of boiling water in the August heat for days at a time, but the payoff lasted 6 months. Number 15, foraging wild greens from ditches, fields, and creek banks. Poke salad, dandelion greens, lamb's quarters, watercress, growing where the creek ran shallow over rocks. These were not weeds to a Depression-era grandmother. They were free food growing in places nobody else thought to look. The trick was knowing which ones to pick, when to pick them young, and how to cook them safe. Poke salad had to be boiled and drained at least twice to draw the bitterness and toxins out. Dandelion leaves were best before the plant flowered, while they were still tender. This was knowledge that came from generations of women who understood the land around them, and it did not cost a single cent at any store. Number 14, keeping a kitchen garden producing food 12 months a year. Most people treat a garden as a summer project. Put some tomatoes in, harvest in August, let the plot go dead in October. A Depression-era Black grandmother treated that same patch of dirt as a year-round operation that never shut down. Spring was for lettuce, radishes, green onions, and early peas. Summer was the heavy season, tomatoes, pole beans, squash, okra, cucumbers, and hot peppers. But fall was where the real skill showed itself. Turnip greens went into the ground in September and kept producing through the first frost. Collards got planted in October and actually tasted sweeter after cold weather hit them. Winter onions sat in the soil through the frozen months and pushed up green shoots as soon as the ground softened. Grandmothers who understood their climate had something green and edible growing in every single month of the year. The rows were short, sometimes just a narrow strip of earth along the side of the house or a few mounds behind the chicken coop, but the ground never sat empty. Composting happened without the word for it, kitchen scraps tossed directly onto the beds to rot and feed the soil. Seeds were saved from season to season, never purchased. Tools were borrowed and shared between 3 or 4 houses on the same road. The result was a household that barely needed the produce section at any store. When supermarkets started expanding into black neighborhoods in the 1950s, these women already had systems in place that outperformed anything on the shelves. They had been feeding families from dirt and patience for decades before the store arrived and tried to charge them for what they already knew how to grow. Number 13, rendering leftover fat into homemade soap. Store-bought soap was an expense that a resourceful grandmother could eliminate entirely. Leftover cooking grease, the old drippings, too dark or too stale to reuse for food, got combined with lye in a heavy pot set up outdoors. The mixture was stirred slowly, poured into shallow wooden molds or a lined pan, and left to harden in the air. What came out was a hard bar of lye soap that cleaned dishes, scrubbed floors, washed clothes on the washboard, and bathed the children on Saturday night. One batch lasted the household for weeks. The process smelled terrible and had to be done outside, but the savings were real and immediate. Every dollar not spent on soap was a dollar freed up for flour, sugar, coffee, or salt. Every grandmother on this list understood something that modern budgeting advice still has not figured out. The grocery bill was never just about food, it was about everything the kitchen touched. Soap, rags, clothes for the children, seasoning, sweetener, medicine from the garden. A Depression-era black grandmother did not draw lines between these categories the way a modern household budget does. She ran the kitchen like a small production line where nothing left is waste and everything that came in served at least 2 purposes. The flour fed the family and dressed the children. The grease cooked the meals and cleaned the house. The garden grew dinner and funded trades with the neighbors. The chicken gave 3 meals and then fertilized the soil that grew next season's greens. This is not nostalgia. This is systems thinking, practiced by women who never heard the term but lived it every single day. Number 12, buying day-old bread at half the price. Fresh bread was for families that did not have to count every penny. A grandmother who knew her local baker or her corner store knew exactly when yesterday's loaves moved to the discount shelf, and she was there before anyone else. Day-old bread made the same toast, the same croutons for soup, the same bread pudding. Crumbled into meatloaf, nobody could taste the difference. Soaked in egg and fried in a hot skillet with a little grease, it became French toast for the children. The bread was never wasted at any stage of its life. Fresh, it was bread. Stale, it was an ingredient. Past stale, it was dried crumbs in a jar. Past crumbs, it went to the chickens in the yard. Number 11, using every single part of the hog from the rooter to the tail. A family that could afford a whole hog at slaughter time in the fall had food security for months. The shoulders and hams were smoked or packed in salt. The belly became bacon. The ribs were slow cooked over low heat. The feet were pickled or boiled down into a gelatin. The ears and snout went into souse meat. The intestines were cleaned, scrubbed, cleaned again, and turned into chitterlings. The head was simmered and pressed into head cheese. The skin was fried crisp into cracklings. The leaf fat was rendered into lard for baking. Even the tail went into a pot of beans for flavor. A saying that passed through many black families put it plainly: they used everything but the squeal. Number 10, growing and drying seasonings instead of buying them. A spice rack from a store cost real money. A bay leaf tree growing in the backyard cost nothing at all. Black grandmothers in the South grew their own flavor right outside the kitchen door. Green onion tops snipped fresh, garlic chives in a patch by the porch, hot peppers ripening on a bush near the fence line, sassafras root dug from the edge of the nearest woods and dried for tea, red pepper flakes crushed by hand from last summer's harvest and stored in a clean jar. These women did not buy seasoning. They grew it, dried it, and passed the seeds and cuttings to their daughters the way they passed down everything else. A kitchen that smelled that good was never expensive. It was educated. Number 9, drying fruit and preserving it without any equipment. When the garden and the fruit trees were producing more than the family could eat fresh, nothing went to waste and nothing needed a freezer. Herbs got tied in small bunches and hung upside down from a nail on the porch or a rafter in the kitchen until they were brittle enough to crumble into storage jars. Hot peppers were threaded on a length of string and draped across the kitchen window like a curtain. Slice, peaches, and apple rings were spread on window screens, propped up on sawhorses in the full sun, and left to shrink into leathery strips that kept through winter. No electricity required, no canning jars, just open air and patience. A grandmother with a full shelf of dry goods by October had already won the winter months before the first cold night arrived. Number 8, trading labor for groceries when there was no cash at all. Money was not the only way to bring food into the house. A grandmother who could sew took in mending for a neighboring farm wife and came home with a bushel of sweet potatoes. A woman who washed and ironed clothes for the white family up the road was often paid partly in food. A ham at Christmas, a sack of flour in March, leftover biscuits wrapped in a cloth on a Tuesday afternoon. Children picked cotton, pulled corn, or gathered pecans on someone else's land and brought home whatever they were given. The exchange was often unequal and sometimes exploitative, but the women who navigated it kept their families fed through stretches when the cash simply did not exist. Number 7, stretching coffee with roasted chicory root. Coffee was one of the few staples a family could not grow in the yard, barter for at the fence, or make from table scraps. It had to be purchased, and during the Depression, even a small bag was a real expense for a family living on sharecropper wages. So grandmothers across Louisiana and the rest of the Deep South reached back to a trick that went all the way to the Civil War, when Union blockades cut off coffee shipments and Southerners had to improvise. Chicory root pulled from the ground where it grew wild in ditches and along country roads was scrubbed clean, sliced thin, dried in the oven on a low flame, and then roasted until it turned dark and fragrant. Ground to a fine powder, it was mixed with the real coffee, half and half. The chicory deepened the color, added a roasted bitterness that blended with the coffee, and made a half pound of beans do the work of a full pound. Some families came to love the taste so much that they never went back, even after money was less tight. In New Orleans, chicory coffee became a tradition that outlived the Depression entirely and is still served in restaurants and homes today. But the origin was not flavor preference. It was an economic decision made by women who refused to surrender their morning cup but could not justify paying full price. The root grew free. The labor was their own. A grandmother who knew where to dig chicory had a coffee extender that cost nothing. For the rest of her life, she dried it, roasted it, ground it in the same hand mill she used for the beans, and mixed them together before the water boiled. Nobody at the breakfast table knew unless she decided to tell them. Number 6, cooking one big communal pot to stretch scraps across the whole family. A pot of beans or stew assembled from whatever was left in the kitchen could feed 8 or 10 people for a fraction of what separate plates would have cost. Monday's leftover rice went in. Tuesday's last scrap of smoked meat went in. A potato from the garden, an onion from the neighbor's trade, a handful of dried lima beans that had been soaking in water overnight. The pot sat on the back of the stove for hours, low and slow. By supper time, it was thick, savory, and enough. This was not a recipe. It was a system. One fire, one pot, one meal. Everybody at the table eats the same thing, and nobody walks away hungry. Number 5, replacing store-bought white sugar with sorghum syrup and molasses. Granulated sugar was a manufactured product with a manufactured price. Sorghum syrup, pressed from cane stalks grown on local farms, was cheap to buy and sometimes free if the family knew someone who operated a mill. Molasses was a byproduct of sugar refining and sold for next to nothing at country stores. Grandmothers used them for everything sweet. Poured over hot biscuits in the morning, stirred into a bowl of oatmeal, baked into gingerbread, cookies, and sweet potato pie, mixed with hot water for a warm drink when coffee ran out. The flavor was darker, richer, and more complex than white sugar ever was. The switch saved real money across every week of the year, and plenty of families never switched back. Number 4, maintaining one cast iron skillet for every cooking job in the house. A Depression-era kitchen did not have a cabinet full of specialty pans. It had one skillet, maybe 2 if the family was fortunate. That single skillet fried eggs at dawn, baked cornbread at midday, seared pork chops at supper, and made a cobbler on Sunday. It was never washed with soap, never scrubbed with anything abrasive, never replaced unless it cracked, which almost never happened. The seasoning built up over years, one thin layer of oil baked into the iron at a time, creating a cooking surface that nothing from a store could match. Grandmothers willed those skillets to their daughters, and their daughters passed them down again. Some of those exact skillets are still in use today, doing the same work they did nearly 100 years ago. Number 3, making vinegar from fruit peels and kitchen scraps. Apple peels, pear cores, bruised peach skins, anything with natural sugar that was headed for the slop bucket got a second life in a wide-mouthed jar filled with water and covered with the cloth. Left to sit undisturbed for several weeks in a warm corner, the mixture fermented slowly into vinegar. That homemade vinegar cleaned kitchen surfaces, preserved pickled vegetables, added sharpness to a pot of collard greens, and replaced the store-bought bottle entirely. The process took patience, not money, and it turned what other families threw away into a pantry staple that lasted for months. One less item on the grocery list, one more trick the store never profited from. Number 2, pooling money with church members to buy staples in bulk. The church was not just a place of worship. It was an economic network with reach that no single family could match alone. Women in the same congregation organized informal buying clubs. They combined their small amounts of cash, purchased flour, sugar, rice, cornmeal, and dried beans in the largest quantities available at wholesale prices, and divided the goods evenly after Sunday service. The savings added up fast. A 50-pound sack of flour cost far less per pound than a 5-pound bag from the corner store. The system required trust, basic arithmetic, and someone with clean handwriting to keep the figures straight. It ran on the same women who ran the usher board, organized the choir, and led the vacation Bible school. Number 1 is not a single trick. It is the trick that made every other trick on this list survive: teaching children to cook before they could read. A 4-year-old standing on a pulled-out kitchen drawer beside the stove, watching cornbread batter go into a smoking hot skillet. A 6-year-old on the back porch, snapping green beans into a bowl held between her knees. An 8-year-old trusted with a paring knife and a pile of sweet potatoes. These grandmothers understood that the grocery bill was never going to get easier on its own. The wages were not going to rise, the prices were not going to drop, the system was never going to become fair. So the only insurance they had was making sure the next generation knew every last thing they knew. That is why these 25 tricks still exist today, not because somebody wrote them in a book, because a grandmother pulled a chair up to the stove, stood a child on it, and made her watch until she could do it with her own hands. The teaching was the trick, and it outlasted everything else.
Baked lima beans were the quiet workhorses of the table. They were cooked in molasses or brown sugar, sometimes with bits of pork or onion, until thick and glossy. The beans came out tender and sweet, hearty enough to stand beside any main dish. It was thrifty food, affordable, filling, and satisfying. Grandparents made them for potlucks, picnics, or whenever they needed something to stretch the meal. Each spoonful carried that deep, comforting flavor that only slow cooking can give. It was a taste of patience and practicality, sweetened by love. The smell alone told stories, earthy, warm, and rich like a kitchen that never went cold. The molasses gave it body while the pork gave it soul, each batch simmering for hours until the flavors settled into harmony. Families ate it hot with bread or cold the next morning, never wasting a bite. In a time when food had to do more than fill you, baked lima beans did just that. They gave you warmth, strength, and the feeling that everything would be all right. Stuffed bell peppers with rice and onion were a dish that stretched garden vegetables into something filling and satisfying. Bell peppers were inexpensive when in season, and my grandmother made the most of them by stuffing each with seasoned rice, onions, and sometimes a bit of tomato. Meat was optional and often absent, but the rice itself carried enough substance to make the meal complete. The peppers were baked until tender, their skins blistering slightly while the rice absorbed every bit of flavor. Each stuffed pepper became its own little meal, portioned perfectly for children and adults alike. The aroma of roasted peppers and onions filled the house, signaling comfort even when budgets were stretched thin. It was a dish that looked impressive despite being made from humble ingredients, and it reminded families that presentation mattered too. Stuffed bell peppers with rice and onion carried both thrift and pride, proving that even in hard times, dinner could be hearty, healthy, and beautiful on the table. Okra fritters, also known as okra cakes, offered crisp golden edges and a tender interior that celebrated the summer garden. Fresh okra pods were chopped fine, mixed with cornmeal, onions, and a dash of pepper, then spooned into hot oil until each patty puffed and browned. Sold at fish fries, church picnics, and traveling fairs, these fritters were easy to eat by hand and full of flavor that tied African heritage to southern soil. The okra gave a subtle sweetness and a soft binding that kept the patties moist while the cornmeal crust provided satisfying crunch. Children waited impatiently beside bubbling skillets, hoping for the first fritter to cool enough to taste. Vendors wrapped them in newspaper cones so families could stroll through evening air scented with music and spice. Modern snack foods have replaced these handcrafted treats, but those who remember the sound of oil popping and the taste of garden-fresh okra know the fritters carried more than flavor. They held the joy of gathering and the pride of turning humble crops into a festival of taste. Ground kudzu root paste emerged when conventional flours were scarce, and starchy substitutes were needed to thicken stews or stretch breads. Kudzu, an invasive vine introduced from Asia, sent deep roots into the southern soil that stored abundant starch. Enslaved gatherers dug these roots, washed and dried them, then pounded them into a fine powder. Mixed with water, the powder formed a paste that thickened soups or acted as a binder for cornmeal cakes. Its mild flavor and reliable texture made it a quiet but important ingredient in times of scarcity. After emancipation, some rural families continued to harvest kudzu for its starch, and today herbalists still value it for its medicinal qualities. Ground kudzu root paste shows how knowledge of local plants and persistence in foraging allowed cooks to replace costly ingredients with what the land freely offered, turning an aggressive vine into a vital pantry staple, and demonstrating again how necessity inspired both culinary creativity and a deeper understanding of the Southern landscape's hidden gifts. Chickenbacks and necks gumbo was the kind of dish that came from deep knowledge, the kind mothers inherited from generations who knew how to stretch poultry scraps into something extraordinary. Backs and necks were the cheapest parts of the bird, often sold for pennies. Mothers browned them, added a dark roux, and slowly layered in vegetables like celery, onions, and bell pepper. The gumbo simmered for hours, building flavor until the whole house smelled like Sunday even on a weekday. Sometimes a leftover bone or a tiny bit of sausage went in, just to deepen the broth served over rice. It became a feast built from scraps. Children never realized how inexpensive it was. They only knew how good it tasted. It warmed the belly, lifted the spirit, and made even the leanest pantry feel full. Chickenbacks and necks gumbo was survival turned into heritage. Hot water cornbread and fried fish scraps were one of the most inventive pairings my grandmother served. Hot water cornbread was made quickly, mixing cornmeal with boiling water and frying it into golden patties that crisped beautifully on the outside. It was fast, cheap, and filling, the kind of bread that appeared often at the table. To go with it, she fried scraps of fish, tails, heads, or thin trimmings left over from larger catches. What some saw as waste became supper, seasoned and fried until crispy. The two together made a meal that cost almost nothing but filled everyone at the table. The cornbread carried smoky richness, while the fish scraps provided flavor and protein. It was food that came from resourcefulness, proof that nothing was discarded if it could be eaten. Hot water cornbread and fried fish scraps carried the legacy of thrift, turning overlooked parts into a dinner that felt whole. Families remembered these meals not just for their flavor, but for their lesson in survival. Field peas and rice were farm food at its finest. Whatever kind of peas you had, Crowder, cream, or black-eyed, they all found their way into this one-pot wonder. The peas simmered slowly in broth until tender, then were folded into a pot of rice that absorbed every drop of flavor. It was hearty, filling, and dependable. This was a meal built from the soil, flavored with what the day's work could offer. Grandparents cooked it on quiet evenings, sometimes adding onion or a scrap of ham hock if luck was kind. Each bowl carried the taste of the field and the pride of self-sufficiency. It was simplicity raised to the level of grace. What made it special wasn't just the ingredients, but the rhythm of making it. The slow stir, the steam rising like a sigh after a long day in the sun. Children watched and learned how to season by instinct, not by measurement. The rice never went to waste, and the peas, humble as they were, became something sacred. It was food that filled more than your belly. It fed your dignity, your patience, your connection to the land itself. Pot roast with carrots and onions was the Sunday ritual that made the whole house smell like home before you even opened your eyes. The roast went into a heavy pot early in the day, searing first before settling into a long simmer with onions, carrots, and maybe a potato or two. Hours passed, the aroma grew richer, and by evening the meat was tender enough to fall apart under the slightest pressure. This was not just a meal, it was a gathering point, a reason for everyone to show up at the table. The vegetables soaked up the broth, turning sweet and soft, and the whole pot felt like comfort poured into a single dish. People still crave it because it tasted like stability, like being cared for, like the end of a long week wrapped neatly in gravy. Molasses, stacked cake graced weddings and homecomings with a sweetness born of patience and skill. Thin layers of spiced cake were baked individually, then stacked high with a rich molasses filling that soaked into the crumb as the dessert rested overnight. The dark syrup lent a deep flavor that spoke of both Caribbean cane fields and Southern kitchens. Families often baked the layers days ahead, turning the assembly into a festive gathering where aunts and cousins worked side by side. Each slice told a story of celebration and endurance, for molasses was affordable and plentiful even when other sweeteners were scarce. The cake's tall, impressive stature made it a centerpiece on tables decorated for special occasions, a symbol of abundance even in lean times. Today, few households take the time to roll, bake, and stack so many delicate layers, and the recipe lives mostly in old family cookbooks. Those who have tasted it know the quiet triumph of a dessert that rewards effort with lasting memory. Smoked frog legs provided unexpected protein from the marshes and bayous surrounding many southern plantations. Skilled foragers caught frogs at night with simple nets or by hand, cleaning the meaty hind legs and seasoning them with salt and wild herbs before smoking them slowly over hickory coals. The gentle smoke preserved the meat for days and gave it a rich, savory flavor that paired well with cornbread or greens. This practice echoed West African traditions of smoking small game and fish to ensure longevity in hot climates. After emancipation, smoked frog legs remained a regional delicacy in Louisiana and coastal communities, later becoming a celebrated dish in Cajun cuisine. They remind us that survival often required deep familiarity with the waterways and a willingness to turn overlooked resources into sustaining meals. Smoked frog legs stand as an example of how necessity and skill created flavors that outlasted hardship, transforming what began as a pragmatic hunt into a distinctive part of Southern culinary heritage and a taste still enjoyed today. Fried fatback with wilted greens was a dinner that stretched almost nothing into something satisfying. Fatback was cheap, salty, and often the only pork a household could afford, but its flavor went a long way. Mothers sliced it into thin pieces and fried them in a hot skillet until the edges curled and turned golden. The rendered fat was then used to cook mustard or collard greens, softening them into a tender, silky pile that tasted deeply seasoned even without meat. Sometimes mothers added a splash of vinegar or a pinch of sugar to balance the sharpness of the greens, turning the pot into something even more comforting. The sizzle of the fatback and the sharp smell of the greens mixed together in a way that pulled children toward the kitchen. They waited near the stove, hoping for a crispy piece fresh from the pan, knowing it might be the only meat they tasted that night. A single piece of fatback on the plate felt like a treat, even though it cost almost nothing. The greens wilted perfectly in the hot pan, absorbing every bit of flavor left behind. Mothers served big portions because greens filled the belly and kept everyone satisfied. It was a simple meal, but it fed the whole family. Fried fatback with wilted greens was resourcefulness turned into tradition. Mustard greens with salt pork were the kind of dish that spoke to both thrift and tradition. Collard greens were loved, but when money was tight, mustard greens filled the pot just as well, with a sharper bite and a quicker cook. My grandmother simmered them slowly with scraps of salt pork, the fat melting into the broth until every leaf carried flavor. The kitchen smelled earthy, smoky, and strong, reminding everyone that even the humblest greens could feel like a feast when seasoned with care. She always said the broth, what some called potlikker, was the best part, soaking it up with cornbread to make sure not a drop was wasted. It was a dish that brought families together around the table, passing bowls and breaking bread even when meat was scarce. Salt pork was cheap because it was mostly fat, but it gave depth to every bite, transforming greens into comfort. In the 1960s, this was not just a side, it was supper, filling bellies after long days of work. Mustard greens with salt pork carried heritage, thrift, and resilience in one simmering pot. Hoppin' John on New Year's Day was once a dish of deep meaning, carrying the promise of good fortune into every household that served it. Black-eyed peas simmered with rice, onions, and smoky cured meat made for a meal that was both filling and symbolic. Families across the South would gather on the first day of the year, confident that a bowl of this humble combination could bring luck, health, and steady work in the months ahead. The peas represented coins, the rice suggested abundance, and the pork gave a sense of strength and perseverance. Elders passed down stories of how this recipe came from West African traditions that traveled through the Middle Passage and took root in Carolina kitchens. Children learned to stir the pot while listening to tales of ancestors who found comfort in its aroma after days of uncertainty. Today, many people know the name, but few carry on the ritual with the same devotion that once marked every New Year's morning across countless African-American homes. Canned salmon croquettes were one of the most beloved budget dinners because they turned a cheap can of fish into something that felt almost fancy. Mothers mixed the salmon with onions, cornmeal or breadcrumbs, eggs, and simple seasonings, shaping the mixture into patties. When they hit the hot skillet, the croquettes sizzled loudly, signaling that dinner would be crisp and golden. The outside browned beautifully, while the inside stayed soft and savory. Sometimes mothers squeezed in a bit of lemon or added chopped peppers when they had extra ingredients, elevating the dish even further. Served with rice, potatoes, or plain bread, the croquettes stretched one can far enough to feed several children. The smell drifted through the house, making everyone hungry long before the meal was served. Kids especially loved the way the crispy coating gave way to the tender filling. Canned salmon croquettes were frugality turned into celebration. Macaroni and stewed tomatoes was a surprisingly tangy, humble dish that stretched every ingredient just a little further, making it a popular staple in the 1960s kitchen. Elbow macaroni boiled until tender was mixed with tomatoes stewed down until they turned soft and slightly sweet, creating a flavor that was simple yet strangely satisfying. It did not pretend to be anything fancy. It was a dish for busy parents, hungry kids, and anyone needing comfort without cost. The tang from the tomatoes mixed with the soft macaroni in a way that stuck in your memory long after childhood passed. Some families topped it with a bit of cheese, some kept it plain, but either way, it tasted warm and familiar, like a weeknight that ended well. It was a dish defined not by extravagance but by reliability, something people still crave because it feels like stepping back into a kitchen where everything was steady and safe. Barbecue pig ears were a dish that showed how deeply rooted thrift and tradition were in Black cooking. Pig ears were among the cheapest cuts, often discarded or sold for pennies at butcher shops. My grandmother cleaned them carefully, simmered them until tender, and then finished them with homemade barbecue sauce that clung to every bite. The texture was chewy but flavorful, and paired with cornbread or greens, it became a meal that carried both satisfaction and culture. Families gathered around plates of pig ears during weekends or special occasions, treating them as a delicacy despite their humble beginnings. The sauce was smoky, tangy, and rich, masking the simplicity of the cut with layers of flavor. Eating barbecue pig ears was about more than just nourishment. It was about making something from nothing, about honoring traditions that valued every part of the animal. In the 1960s, dishes like this kept families connected to heritage and survival alike. Barbecue pig ears turned scraps into a meal that was cheap but never forgotten. Tomato okra rice stew, sometimes called country stew, was a dish built from the garden and the pantry, relying on vegetables and rice instead of meat. Mothers combined canned tomatoes, fresh or frozen okra, onions, and seasonings in a large pot, letting everything soften into a thick, spoonable stew. A little garlic or hot pepper was added when available, giving the pot a gentle heat that made it even more satisfying. Rice was added to stretch the meal, swelling as it absorbed the tomato broth. The mixture simmered for a long time, sending up warm, familiar scents that wrapped the house in comfort. Children gathered near the stove, lifting the lid even when told not to, eager to see the bubbling stew. Kids loved its bright flavor and soft texture, especially when paired with cornbread. They learned early that vegetables could stand on their own when seasoned with care. It was a filling dinner made from the most basic ingredients, yet it never felt lacking. Tomato okra rice stew was proof that even plant-based meals could feel rich.
25 tricks. Not one of them came from a textbook or a television program. All of them came from women who refused to let a grocery bill decide whether their families ate well or went without. The jar of saved grease, the flour sack dress, the chicory stretched into the coffee, the garden that never stopped producing. These were not signs of poverty, they were proof of mastery. Try one this week. Save the grease. Grow a row of collards from saved seed. Make one chicken last 3 meals and see how it changes the way you think about your own kitchen. Drop the trick your family used that did not make this list, the one nobody wrote down, the one that kept your people fed when the world said they should not have made it.